The truck engine sputtered and fell silent, leaving nothing but the rasp of wind scraping across the empty yard. She stepped down, her thin shoes sinking into dry, powdery earth. The door slammed behind her, a final punctuation mark to a decision she had never made. Her uncle didn't glance back. His hands stayed clenched on the steering wheel, eyes staring ahead as though she were already invisible. Without a word, he shifted gears and rolled away down the narrow dirt road, a cloud of dust swallowing him whole. She stood there alone, clutching a small cloth bag pressed to her chest. The bag felt absurdly light, holding only a change of clothes, an old hairbrush, and a worn book she hadn't finished. Her fingers trembled on the handle as though it might float away if she loosened her grip. Ahead loomed the ranch house. 2 stories, paint stripped by years of sun and wind, windows that reflected the sky like blind eyes. Wooden beams framed the porch, but none of it looked welcoming. Instead, it all seemed to lean forward, watching her. A tall man stood in the shadows of the doorway. His hat's brim cut across his face, turning him into a silhouette. His arms were folded tightly, boots rooted into the porch like they had never moved in years. He didn't nod or raise a hand. He simply waited. She took a step forward, her feet heavy, each movement echoing inside her skull. The smell of dust and dry grass clung to the air. A barbed wire fence encircled the yard, stretching to the far horizon where fields browned and shriveled under the sun. A crow perched on one of the fence posts, its black eyes sharp and hollow. It cawed once, the sound slicing through the silence. She flinched, her shoulders hunching instinctively. As she approached, her heartbeat pounded against her ribs like a trapped animal. She noticed scars on the wood railing, deep gouges as if something or someone had clawed at them. The steps creaked beneath her weight, but he didn't move. His face stayed hidden, mouth a straight, unreadable line. She swallowed hard, the taste of copper on her tongue. The man finally shifted, his head tilting ever so slightly. "You're late," he said. His voice was low, as if pulled from a dry well. She opened her mouth, but nothing came out. A dry click in her throat betrayed her. "You listen now," he continued, each word delivered with precise, measured force. No wandering, no talking to anyone outside, no noise. She nodded. Her eyes drifted to the cracked floorboards beneath her feet. "Tomorrow you work," he added. "For now, go inside. Upstairs room on the right. You stay there till called?" She hesitated. Behind him, the interior looked darker than the sky at midnight. A smell of old smoke and earth drifted from within. He stepped aside, leaving the doorway open like a mouth waiting to swallow her whole. She forced herself forward, knees almost giving out with each hesitant shuffle. As she crossed the threshold, the door slammed shut behind her, shaking the frame. The air inside pressed down on her lungs, thick with something she couldn't name. She heard the faint tick of an unseen clock, the distant rustle of fabric. Somewhere, someone was moving. She paused on the narrow rug, feeling watched even though the hallway looked empty. Turning to glance back, she saw only the man's outline through the thin crack of the door. His hat, his stillness, the weight of his gaze, all followed her like an invisible chain. She took the first step up the staircase, wood groaning beneath her. In that instant, she knew something had shifted forever. There was no turning back, no running, only the echo of her own breath and the silent promise that from this moment on, every choice she made would come with a price she couldn't yet understand. The room upstairs smelled of dust and old wood. A single bed stood in the corner, its thin blanket rumpled and frayed at the edges. She set her cloth bag on the floor and sat on the edge of the mattress, fingers twisting the hem of her dress. Each creak of the boards beneath her feet sounded like a gunshot in the silent house. A thin beam of late morning light slipped through a narrow crack in the wall, painting a pale line across her knees. She watched it tremble, as if the house itself was breathing, alive and watchful. Her mouth was dry, her throat raw from holding back words, questions, pleas. But there was no one to ask. She had barely begun to collect her thoughts when a heavy knock rattled the door. She flinched, heart stuttering. The door opened without waiting for permission, and he stepped inside. The man filled the doorway, his shoulders seeming even wider in the close space. His eyes moved over the room before settling on her. He didn't speak right away, just stood there breathing slow and steady, as though tasting the air for signs of defiance. "Stand up," he said finally. She obeyed immediately, her knees weak. "You listen to me now," he continued, voice low and even, like a rope tightening around her ribs. "You do not leave this room unless I tell you. You do not step into the yard without me. You do not speak to anyone. You work when told. You sleep when told." She nodded, eyes fixed on the floorboards. "Look at me," he commanded. She forced her gaze upward, meeting his eyes. They were pale and empty, like the belly of a dead fish. She felt something inside her curl away, shrinking into a smaller and smaller space. "You understand?" "Yes," she whispered, though it sounded more like a breath than a word. "Good." He stepped forward, closer than she wanted. His breath smelled of iron and earth, old and sour. He lifted one finger and tapped it against her forehead, slow and deliberate. "You forget this. You sleep outside. You try to run. You disappear. You think about noise. You regret it?" She didn't move. Her feet felt nailed to the floor. Finally, he lowered his hand and turned, his boots thudding against the boards. At the doorway, he paused and looked back once, his face still in shadow. Then he left, closing the door behind him. The silence that followed felt even heavier than his presence. She sank back onto the bed, pressing her palms against her chest to calm the frantic drumming of her heart. Each shallow breath scraped at her lungs. Through the thin walls, she heard the muffled sounds of the ranch, the distant clank of metal, a horse snorting, boots moving in the yard, but no voices. It was as if the entire place was wrapped in a silent agreement. Don't speak. Don't question. Don't exist beyond your use. She stood and moved to the small window, but it was nailed shut. Beyond it, she saw the yard. Dry dirt, stray tufts of brittle grass, a sagging fence. A figure moved slowly along the fence line. A worker maybe, head down, shoulders bent under some invisible weight. For a moment, she wanted to pound on the glass, scream, wave her arms. Instead, she pressed her forehead against the dirty pane and closed her eyes. The hours passed slowly, measured by the movement of light across the walls. Her stomach cramped with hunger, but she didn't dare leave the room. She knew he was somewhere below, listening, waiting for the smallest betrayal. When the sun started to sink, a shadow moved outside her door. It swung open, and the man stood there again. "Kitchen," he said simply. She followed him down the narrow stairs, her legs trembling. The hallway was dim, each step echoing. At the base of the stairs, a thick smell of burnt fat and boiled potatoes clung to the air. In the kitchen, a woman stood by the stove. Thin, her hair tied back tight, shoulders stooped as if carrying a lifetime of silence. She didn't look up. Instead, she slid a plate across the counter, a piece of bread, a gray lump of something that might have been meat, and a cup of water. "Eat," the man ordered. She took the plate and sat on a rough wooden stool. Her hands shook as she lifted the bread to her mouth. Every chew felt like swallowing stones. The man stood against the wall, arms folded, eyes never leaving her. The woman at the stove didn't speak or turn. She only stirred something in a pot, her spoon scraping the bottom in an endless circle. When she finished, the man gestured to the door. "Up," he said. She rose and walked past him, each step an effort to stay upright. As she reached the stairs, she felt his gaze drilling into her back, pushing her up each step, branding her with the knowledge that she was no longer her own. Back in her room, she collapsed on the bed, the thin blanket rough against her skin. She curled up, knees to chest, and listened to the sounds below. The man's boots moved once, then silence. In the darkness, her mind replayed his words, each one burning like a brand inside her. She wanted to scream, to run, to tear at the walls until her fingers bled. But her body refused. It lay still, caged by fear. When sleep finally came, it was shallow and haunted by the echo of footsteps, the smell of earth and iron, and the cold certainty that tomorrow would be no different. At dawn, a dull knock on the door jolted her awake. The pale gray light creeping through the crack in the wall painted everything in a colorless haze. She rubbed her eyes and sat up slowly, her muscles aching from the night, curled into a tight ball. The door opened before she could answer. The man stood there motionless, a silhouette against the dim hallway. "Come," he said, his voice low and hard. She obeyed without a word. Her bare feet met the cold boards, each step sharp and biting. As she stepped into the hallway, the smell of smoke and boiled grain filled her nose, heavy and stale. Downstairs, she saw the woman from the night before, standing at the stove again. Today, the woman wore a dark, long dress, her hair pinned so tightly it seemed to pull at her scalp. Her eyes stayed down, focused on the pot she stirred. The man gestured to a bucket near the back door. "Water," he said. She moved toward it, hands trembling as she lifted the heavy tin pail. Its metal handle dug into her palm, leaving deep red lines. She hesitated by the door, eyes drifting outside to the yard. A thin trail of smoke rose from a distant shed. Near the fence, two figures bent over a pile of wood, moving in slow, mechanical rhythm. One of them looked up briefly, but their face remained hidden under a wide straw hat. She wondered if they saw her, if they cared, but no one spoke. She carried the bucket back inside, setting it carefully near the sink. The woman poured some into a chipped basin and handed her a rough cloth. Without words, she understood. Wash. She scrubbed her hands and face, the water icy against her skin. Each movement felt heavy, as if she were moving underwater. When she finished, the woman handed her a small piece of dry bread. She ate it standing, feeling the man's gaze burning into her back from across the room. Later, the man motioned for her to follow. He led her through a narrow hallway to a back storage room. Inside, she saw old farm tools, coils of rope, sacks of feed stacked against the walls. A single window high on the wall let in a thin blade of light, illuminating floating dust like a silent snowfall. "Sort these," he said, pointing to a pile of torn cloths and broken baskets in the corner. She knelt without complaint, her fingers sifting through the brittle fabric. Some pieces were stained dark. Others still smelled of earth or sweat. Every so often, she glanced toward the door, half expecting him to appear behind her, looming in the doorway. Hours passed this way. The air in the storage room grew stifling, thick with dust that clung to her throat. She could hear the slow, steady footsteps from the hallway, the occasional metallic clink of tools outside, the distant whinny of a horse. At midday, the woman from the kitchen appeared at the door carrying a small bowl. She set it down on a crate without speaking and left immediately. Inside, she found thin soup, gray and watery, with a single piece of carrot floating like a dead fish. She swallowed it quickly, not because she was hungry, but because she feared leaving it too long might be seen as defiance. When she finished, she returned to her sorting. Pieces of fabric slipped through her fingers like dead leaves. Once, she found a torn ribbon, pale blue, stiff with old dirt. She turned it over and over in her hands, her mind drifting to a time she could not quite recall. Laughter, softer voices, a mother's arms. She pressed it to her face for a moment, but then forced herself to drop it and keep working. Later, she heard a sound at the doorway. The woman stood there watching. Their eyes met for the first time. The woman's eyes looked hollow, sunken, as though she had once screamed and then forgotten how. After a long moment, the woman looked away and disappeared again, leaving her alone with the dust and scraps. When evening came, the man returned. He scanned the pile she had sorted, his expression unreadable. He bent down, picked up a bundle of cloth, and inspected it carefully. "Good," he said, his voice carrying no warmth, only the flat acknowledgement of obedience. He gestured for her to stand. Her legs trembled as she rose, the blood rushing painfully back into her knees. He guided her out of the room and back into the hallway. As they passed the kitchen, she saw the woman stirring a pot again. Their eyes met once more. This time, the woman's lips parted slightly as though she wanted to speak, but then they closed and she turned her back. Upstairs, the man paused outside her door. His hand hovered on the frame for a moment, as if he might say something, but he didn't. He stepped aside, allowing her to enter first. Inside, the air felt denser, as though the walls had grown thicker during the day. She stood for a moment, listening to the footsteps fade down the hall. Then she moved to the small window and pressed her forehead against the cold glass. Outside, dusk swallowed the yard. The fence posts turned into dark silhouettes against the deepening sky. She saw the same two figures moving along the edge of the field, their shapes blurred by the fading light. She wondered again if they saw her, if they heard her silent questions echoing through the glass. She stepped back, her reflection wavering in the dusty pane, a thin ghost in a colorless dress, eyes wide and hollow. She lay down on the bed without removing her dress, curling into herself. The image of the blue ribbon haunted her mind, twisting around her thoughts like a creeping vine. Tomorrow, she knew, would come the same. Orders, silence, endless dust. But tonight, for the first time, she held on to one small, fragile thread of connection. That glance from the woman in the kitchen, that almost word, that shared understanding buried in empty eyes. In the dark, she clutched it to her chest, as if it might keep her alive. The next morning arrived as a gray smudge across the window, more a suggestion of light than true dawn. She woke to the scrape of boots outside her door. Her muscles ached from the cold. Her body curled so tightly, she felt her spine had fused into a single stiff line. The door creaked open without a knock. The man stood there, face unreadable as always. He nodded once, and she rose at once, smoothing her wrinkled dress as though that tiny gesture might earn her mercy. He led her down the hallway and through the kitchen, where the woman stood by the stove, eyes fixed on a bubbling pot. The woman did not turn or speak. Only the slow circle of her spoon marked her presence, an endless, silent dance. Outside, the air bit at her skin. A sharp wind dragged dry leaves across the yard, the sound like a chorus of whispers. She kept her head down, eyes on the dirt. He pointed to a pile of old wooden crates stacked near the fence. "Move these," he said, his voice cutting through the air like a blade. She nodded and began to work, lifting each crate with trembling arms. The wood was rough and splintered, leaving thin red lines along her fingers and palms. With each crate, the yard revealed more of itself. A cracked trough, rusted tools half buried in the dirt, a broken wheel leaning against the fence. Beyond the fence, endless fields stretched out, pale and brittle under the morning sun. She felt a sudden, sharp pull in her chest, an instinct to run, to leap the fence and vanish into that wide, empty land. But she knew better. She knew his eyes were on her, even when he wasn't near. While moving the crates, she heard a noise from the side of the house, a soft, metallic rattle, like a door chain slipping free. She turned her head slightly, just enough to catch a glimpse. A small side door hung ajar. It led into a narrow passage between the house and a collapsed shed. For a fleeting moment, she imagined slipping through it, running until her lungs burst. But before she could even consider it, a low cough snapped her back. The man stood by the main gate now, watching her with arms folded. Even from a distance, she felt the weight of his gaze pinning her in place like an insect on a board. She returned to her task, each crate heavier than the last. Her breathing grew ragged, sweat clinging to the back of her neck despite the cold wind. When she finished, she stood beside the final crate, hands shaking. The man approached slowly, the dirt crunching beneath his boots. "Done," he said, not as praise, but as a fact. He gestured toward the house. She followed, stumbling slightly, her legs heavy as stone. In the kitchen, the woman set a bowl on the table without looking up. A thin broth, barely enough to warm her lips. She sat and sipped it, her fingers tight around the bowl to keep them from trembling. The man stood in the doorway, arms crossed. She felt his presence as a solid wall behind her, each sip of broth echoing too loud in the silent room. Once she finished, he took her back upstairs without a word. At her door, he paused, leaning closer than before. His breath smelled like metal and dust. "You watch too much," he said softly. "Eyes stay down." She lowered her head quickly, her stomach turning to ice. "Understand?" "Yes," she whispered, almost choking on the word. He waited, his silence thicker than any shout, before turning and disappearing down the hall. She stepped into her room, closing the door behind her as gently as she could. Her heart drummed in her chest, an erratic rhythm that refused to settle. Inside, she sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the wall. She could still feel the weight of his words, the heat of his breath on her cheek. She hated herself for obeying so easily, for shrinking at every sound. But each time she thought of defying him, the memory of his eyes, pale, empty, infinite, closed around her mind like a trap. Hours passed. The light shifted slowly, sliding across the floor like a thin, dying creature. As evening fell, she heard noises below. Doors creaking open and shut, the distant clatter of pots, the slow tread of heavy boots across the hall. Once, she thought she heard a sharp cry, quickly muffled. She strained her ears, her whole body taut, but the sound never came again. She moved to the window, pressing her palm against the glass. Beyond the fence, the fields blurred into shadows. She imagined voices carried on the wind, imagined hands reaching out from the darkness to pull her away. But the yard stayed silent, the fence an unbroken line of teeth against the dusk. She turned and sank to the floor, her back against the wall. Slowly, she pulled her knees to her chest, folding herself into the smallest shape she could manage. In her mind, she traced the path from her room to the side door, past the shed, into the fields. Each detail repeated over and over, like a whispered prayer. But then she saw his face again, hovering in the darkness of her thoughts, and the plan fell apart. She stayed there long after the last light faded, listening to the house breathe around her. Floorboards settled with low moans. Pipes ticked like distant footsteps. In those sounds, she felt a presence, a watchful, patient thing that waited for her to move, to fail, to try. Finally, she crawled onto the bed, curling tight under the thin blanket. Her eyes stayed open, tracing shapes in the dark. Even as exhaustion dragged her down, she kept listening, waiting for the moment when she might dare to look up again. In the last flicker before sleep claimed her, she thought she saw a pale face at the crack of her door. A shadow, a ghost, or maybe just her own fear reflected back at her. Morning came without warmth. A gray hush spread through the house like a thin fog, seeping into her bones before she even opened her eyes. She lay still for a long time, listening to the slow drip of water somewhere inside the walls. When she finally sat up, the sound of footsteps came almost immediately. The door opened. The man didn't speak. He simply motioned her forward with a slow, deliberate gesture. She stood, hands trembling against her sides. Her legs felt as if they belonged to someone else, heavy and stiff. She stepped past him, careful not to brush against his coat. Downstairs, the kitchen smelled of boiled grain and wet ash. The woman was there again, stirring, her head lowered so deeply it looked as if she might disappear into the pot. The man handed her a folded piece of brown paper and a pencil stub. She looked at it, confused. "Write," he ordered. She hesitated, eyes darting to the woman, but the woman did not move. Only the rhythmic scrape of the spoon answered her. "Letter. To your uncle," he continued. His tone was flat, but each word landed like a hammer. "Tell him you are fine. Tell him you stay here. Happy." She felt her throat tighten. The pencil shook in her fingers as she bent over the paper. "Dear Uncle," she wrote slowly, her letters crooked and small. "I am well here. They are kind. I will stay and work. Do not come for me." Her hand hovered at the end, the pencil tip trembling over the page. 1,000 words screamed inside her skull, clawing to get out. She wanted to write, "Help me. Please take me away. I'm not safe." But the pale eyes behind her pinned those thoughts in place, heavy and cold. When she finished, he snatched the paper from her hands. His eyes scanned it quickly, his face unreadable. He folded it twice and slipped it into his pocket. "Good," he said. She lowered her head, her breathing ragged. Without warning, he grabbed her arm and dragged her across the kitchen. She stumbled to keep up, her feet slipping on the worn floorboards. He opened a small side door she hadn't noticed before, revealing a cramped, dim hallway leading toward a storage shed. At the end, he pushed her inside. The shed smelled of mold and earth. Old tools hung on the walls like silent witnesses. A pile of potatoes filled the corner, their skins wrinkled and damp. "Sort," he barked. "Bad ones here, good ones there." He shoved a crate toward her and stepped out, slamming the door. The echo of the latch clicked in her chest like a lock on her own ribs. She dropped to her knees, breath shallow. Her fingers moved automatically, picking up each potato, turning it, feeling for soft spots or dark bruises. Hours blurred, her hands blackened with dirt, nails packed with grime. Each time she looked up, the narrow window above showed only a sliver of the sky, moving slowly from gray to pale yellow and back to gray again. At one point, she heard footsteps outside. A shadow passed the window. The woman. She paused for a moment, her thin form framed in the pale light. Their eyes met. The woman's gaze flicked to the pile, then to the door, then back to her face. Her lips parted slightly, but no words came, only a silent warning, or maybe a shared grief. Then she vanished, swallowed by the dark hallway beyond. A sudden rush of defiance sparked inside the girl's chest. Her breath came faster, sharp and hot. She glanced at the crate, at the paper scraps left behind from old bags in the corner. She grabbed a torn piece, her fingers shaking violently. With a fragment of charcoal she found among the tools, she scribbled, "Help me. He lies. I can't leave. Please." She hid the note deep inside a sack at the edge of the pile, her heart thundering so loudly she thought it might shake the shed apart. When she heard footsteps again, she barely managed to sit upright, wiping her hands on her dress. The door swung open and he stepped inside. His eyes swept the room. He said nothing at first. He only looked at her, at the piles she'd made. Finally, he nodded once and motioned her forward. Back in the kitchen, she stood by the table while he washed his hands at the basin. The woman moved past her silently, placing a small cup of thin broth on the edge. She lifted it to her lips, her hands almost too weak to hold it. Each sip scraped down her throat like glass. As she finished, he stepped close. Too close. His breath, heavy with the scent of dirt and smoke, settled against her cheek. "You think you can talk?" he whispered, his voice low, more a vibration than sound. She froze. Her eyes snapped to the floor. "You think they listen?" His hand closed around her wrist, squeezing until her bones cried out. She bit her lip so hard she tasted blood. Finally, he released her. She stumbled backward, nearly dropping the cup. "Upstairs," he snapped. She moved, her feet numb, her breath shallow and broken. Up the stairs, into the room, door shutting behind her like a tombstone falling into place. She stood there for a long time, unable to move. The memory of the note burned behind her eyes. Did he know? Would he find it? What would he do when he did? She sank onto the bed, curling into herself so tightly she felt she might vanish altogether. The window offered no comfort, only a pale reflection of a girl she barely recognized. Her own eyes seemed hollow, like two empty rooms. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the loose boards and moaning through the cracks. She pressed her hands over her ears, trying to block it all out. Somewhere below, she heard his boots cross the floor. Slowly, methodically, she imagined them coming for her, each step a drumbeat counting down to her end. In the darkness, she mouthed silent prayers to no one. Please, please, please. She didn't sleep that night. Instead, she lay curled on the bed, eyes open wide in the dark. Every creak of the floorboards, every sigh of the wind outside felt like a breath on her neck. The thought of the note she had hidden clawed at her mind, tearing at her from the inside. Somewhere deep in the night, she heard the soft murmur of boots outside her door. She pressed her palms against her mouth to keep from making a sound. The steps paused, then moved on. But her heartbeat refused to slow. When dawn finally arrived, pale and thin through the dusty window, her body felt as though it had been wrung dry. Her limbs ached, her head pounded with each shallow breath. The door opened before the light fully reached the floor. The man stood there, still as a statue. He tilted his head slightly as if examining a stray dog. "Out," he said. She forced her body to move, each step heavy and uncertain. He led her downstairs, through the kitchen where the woman stood once again at the stove, eyes glued to the pot. Outside, the air bit at her skin, colder than any morning before. Frost sparkled along the fence, glinting like tiny knives. "Fence," he ordered, pointing to the far edge of the yard where the fence sagged under the weight of time and neglect. She moved toward it slowly, each step sinking into the brittle earth. When she reached the fence, she saw tools scattered along the ground. A hammer, coils of wire, bent nails. "Fix it," he said, voice flat. Her fingers trembled as she bent to pick up the hammer. The wood felt rough and splintered against her palm. She started to work, fumbling with the nails, the wire slipping from her numb fingers again and again. He watched from a few steps away, arms crossed, eyes cold and unwavering. Hours passed. Her hands grew red and raw. A nail bent and flew into the dust. She scrambled after it, knees tearing open on the rough ground. Each time she looked up, his eyes drilled into her, silent and merciless. At some point, her gaze flicked to the fields beyond the fence. Empty, endless. A horizon that seemed to whisper promises she no longer dared to believe. She felt her mind slip. A single, desperate thought, clawing its way to the surface. Run. Her body acted before her mind could stop it. She dropped the hammer and lunged for the fence, fingers clutching at the splintered wood. The top rung bit into her palms as she pulled herself up, breath burning in her throat. She heard him shout behind her, the sound tearing through the yard like a whip crack. Her foot found a narrow gap in the boards. She pushed harder, hauling herself higher. The cold air lashed at her face, her heart a wild drumbeat in her chest. Then a hand clamped around her ankle, yanking her down so violently she felt her shoulder wrench in its socket. She fell backward into the dirt, the impact blasting the air from her lungs. He stood over her, breath ragged, eyes bright with something darker than rage. His fingers wrapped around her wrist, squeezing until her bones shrieked in pain. "Ungrateful," he hissed, his voice low, vibrating against her skull. "You think you can leave?" She tried to pull free, kicking at the ground, but he only tightened his grip. "You belong here," he growled. "No more letters, no more eyes at the fence. You stay." He dragged her across the yard, her heels cutting deep lines in the frost-hardened dirt. At the house, he shoved her inside, her body crashing against the wall. She gasped, trying to stand, but her legs refused to obey. The woman stood at the kitchen doorway, eyes wide, spoon clutched to her chest. For one heartbeat, their eyes met. The woman's gaze, full of something unspoken, a silent plea or an apology that dissolved before it formed. He pulled her toward a narrow door under the stairs. With one brutal motion, he flung it open and shoved her inside. The small cellar smelled of damp earth and rotting wood. The floor was cold, the walls close enough that her elbows scraped against them as she fell. He slammed the door shut, plunging her into total darkness. She heard the scrape of a bolt sliding into place, the finality of it echoing inside her skull. She lay there panting, her wrists burning from his grip. The taste of iron filled her mouth, and she realized she had bitten her tongue. She pressed her forehead to the cold floor, her mind reeling in jagged flashes. The fence, the sky, the woman's eyes. The hope that had sparked, however briefly, guttered out, leaving only a cold, hollow ache in its place. Minutes passed, or maybe hours. She had no way to know. The darkness swallowed her sense of time, of self. She crawled forward, her fingers tracing along the damp dirt and splintered boards. In the corner she felt something hard, an old bucket, half rotted. She pushed it aside, her breath ragged, searching for any sign of escape. There was none. Only the black walls pressing in, the echo of her heartbeat loud and alone. She pulled her knees to her chest, rocking slowly. In the absence of light, the walls seemed to breathe, closing around her with each shallow inhale. She thought of her mother's voice, soft and distant, calling her home in the fading dusk. She tried to hold on to that memory, but it slipped through her fingers like sand. At last, her body gave in to exhaustion. She lay on her side, cheek pressed to the cold earth. Her eyes remained open long after her mind drifted into the restless, jagged edge of sleep, a sleep filled with the echo of boots, the hiss of his voice, and the endless, unreachable sky. She didn't know how long she had been on the cellar floor when the door finally creaked open. A thin line of gray light stabbed into the darkness, slicing across her tangled hair and dirt-smeared face. She blinked slowly, her eyes stinging as if they had forgotten what light was. Her body refused to move at first, her arms wrapped around her knees in a silent, desperate armor. A figure stood in the doorway, not the man. Smaller, softer. The woman. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The woman's silhouette trembled in the thin light. She clutched something close to her chest, her shoulders hunched as though she carried a heavy stone. Finally, the woman stepped inside, the door clicking shut behind her. She knelt down, close enough that their breath mixed in the cold air. In her hands, she held a chipped enamel cup filled with water and a small piece of bread. The girl's eyes fixed on the bread first, then on the woman's face. There was something in the woman's eyes, a depth of exhaustion so profound it looked like a second skin. "Eat," the woman whispered, her voice thin and trembling, as if unused for years. The girl reached out slowly, her fingers brushing against the woman's. She felt warmth there, fragile and fleeting, like the last ember of a dying fire. She took the bread, biting it carefully. The crust scraped her dry throat, but she forced it down. The water tasted of iron and old pipes, but it washed the dust from her tongue. The woman watched her in silence, her eyes darting once toward the door. "They don't come back," the woman said suddenly, the words falling from her lips like loose nails. The girl froze, her pulse thundering. "Before you," the woman continued, her voice lower now, eyes locked on the dirt floor. "There were others. Girls. Younger. Older. It doesn't matter." She swallowed hard, her lips cracked and pale. "They tried to run. He always found them. Always." The girl felt her breath catch in her throat. Her mind flashed to the torn ribbon she had found in the storage room, to the dark stains on the old cloth, to the hushed cries she had heard at night. Pieces fell into place with a slow, sickening weight. What happened to them?" she whispered, her voice barely more than a breath. The woman shook her head, her fingers twisting in the fabric of her skirt. "Some he sent away," she said. "Some he buried. Some just vanished." The words seemed to echo in the small cellar, bouncing off the damp walls and settling into her bones. The girl pressed her forehead against her knees, trying to keep her thoughts from shattering. She wanted to ask more. How many? Where? Why? but her voice refused to form the questions. The woman leaned closer, her breath warm against the girl's ear. "He watches everything," she said, her words tight and urgent. "Even me, even now." She paused, her eyes glancing upward at the ceiling as though she could see through the floorboards above. "If you try again," she continued, her hand gripping the girl's shoulder, "you must be ready to die, because he would rather see you dead than free." The girl's entire body trembled. She felt the weight of those words crush whatever fragile thread of hope she had been clinging to. The woman released her shoulder, her hand lingering for a moment in a final, silent apology. She stood slowly, joints creaking, and backed toward the door. Before she left, she looked over her shoulder once more, her lips parted as if to say something else. Something that might have mattered, something that might have saved them both. But she closed her mouth and slipped out into the dim hallway. The door shut behind her, the bolt sliding home with a final echoing certainty. Alone again, the girl curled tighter, the cup still clutched in her hands. Her mind replayed the woman's words over and over until they merged with the sound of her heartbeat, an endless, throbbing chant. "He would rather see you dead than free." In that moment, she realized the house wasn't just a prison of wood and nails. It was alive, a breathing, watchful creature that fed on her fear. Every board, every shadow, every whisper of wind carried his presence. She pressed her forehead harder against her knees, as if she might disappear into herself. Images of escape flickered behind her eyes. The fence, the fields, the night sky beyond the yard. But they seemed so distant now, as unreachable as stars on the other side of glass. Hours passed in silence, broken only by the scurry of something in the dark. A rat, maybe, or just her imagination. Finally, when exhaustion clawed her down into a shallow, restless sleep, she dreamed of hands reaching for her, pulling her back each time she got close to the fence. Faces without eyes, fields that stretched on forever, but never offered a way out. And through it all, the woman's voice followed her, a thin thread of sorrow and warning. They don't come back. He always finds them. Always. She didn't remember falling asleep. When she opened her eyes, the cellar was darker than before, the air thick with the scent of earth and rot. Her body ached from the cold, her fingers stiff and swollen. She lay there for a moment, listening for any sound above. A footstep, a creak, a voice. But there was nothing. Only her shallow breathing and the slow drip of water somewhere in the corner. Then she heard it, the heavy scrape of the bolt sliding open. Light spilled across the dirt floor, blinding her. She shielded her eyes with one trembling hand. The man stood in the doorway, his shoulders wide, his head tilted slightly as he studied her. In his hand, he held a leather strap, coiled and dark. "Out," he said, his voice low and steady. She forced herself upright, each movement stiff and painful. Her legs threatened to buckle as she stepped forward, but he grabbed her arm and hauled her out into the narrow hallway. The house felt colder than the cellar, the air sharp against her skin. He dragged her through the kitchen, past the woman who stood frozen by the stove. The spoon in her hand hovered above the pot, drops falling back into the broth with soft splashes. Their eyes met for the briefest instant. The woman's gaze wide and hollow, her lips pressed into a thin, trembling line. Then she looked away, her whole body shrinking inward. Outside, the sky was pale and cloudless, the yard empty except for a pile of broken crates near the fence. He shoved her forward, her knees scraping the ground as she fell. "Stand," he ordered. She tried, her hands slipping in the dirt. When she finally managed to rise, her shoulders hunched, her head bowed so low her hair fell across her face. He uncoiled the strap slowly, letting the end trail across the dirt. Her breath caught in her throat. Her heart pounded so hard she thought it might split open. "You think you can defy me," he said. His voice was quiet, almost gentle, but each word dripped with cold finality. "You think you can run? Write notes. Look at me when I say no." She shook her head frantically, her lips moving but no sound escaping. He stepped closer, raising the strap. The first strike landed across her back, fire blooming along her spine. She fell to her knees, a hoarse cry tearing from her throat. He hit her again, and again. The sharp crack of leather against skin echoed across the yard, swallowed by the empty fields beyond. She pressed her forehead into the dirt, trying to vanish into the earth, her arms covering her head. The pain rolled over her in waves, each one pulling her further from herself. Somewhere beyond the haze, she heard the woman's voice, a low, broken sob drifting from the kitchen door. But the man didn't stop. Each strike was precise, methodical, as though he were repairing a broken fence rather than breaking a human soul. When he finally stopped, she lay trembling in the dirt, her dress torn, her skin burning with raw open welts. Her breath came in short, ragged gasps, her vision swimming. He crouched beside her, his hand gripping her chin roughly, forcing her to look up. Her eyes, blurred with tears and dirt, struggled to focus on his pale, empty gaze. "You belong to me," he whispered, his fingers digging into her jaw. "Every breath, every thought, every piece of you. Mine." He let her head drop, standing slowly. For a moment, he watched her as if admiring a finished piece of work. Then he turned and walked back toward the house, his boots leaving sharp prints in the soft earth. The woman hovered in the doorway, her hand pressed to her mouth. When he passed her, she flinched, stepping back as though his shadow alone could wound her. She stayed there, trembling, watching the girl for a moment longer. Then she disappeared inside, the door closing with a soft click that sounded louder than any scream. The girl stayed on the ground, curled into herself. The wind picked up, dragging dry leaves across her torn dress. Each breath was a battle, each small movement a new explosion of pain. She didn't know how long she lay there. Time unraveled around her, the sun creeping higher, the shadows shifting. Finally, she pushed herself up, inch by inch, her body screaming in protest. She staggered toward the house, leaning on the wall for support. The door was ajar. She slipped inside, collapsing onto the cold floor of the hallway. Somewhere above, she heard his footsteps, slow and deliberate, pacing. She closed her eyes, the taste of blood and dirt thick on her tongue. The word mine echoed in her skull, reverberating through her bones. She pressed her forehead against the floor, her tears soaking into the wood. In that moment, something deep inside her, something soft and bright, flickered and went dark. But beneath the darkness, hidden in the smallest, most secret part of her, a tiny ember remained, weak, almost invisible, but not yet gone. She stayed on the floor until the light began to fade from the hallway, her breath shallow and her body a map of pain. Every movement sent sharp jolts up her spine, but lying still hurt even more. She forced herself to crawl inch by inch toward the narrow stairs. The house felt different now. Each creak and groan of the old wood seemed louder, more alive. The air hung thick and heavy, carrying a silent message that she could almost hear if she listened too closely. You are not alone. You are never alone. When she finally reached her room, she collapsed on the bed without undressing. The thin blanket scratched her torn skin, but she was too exhausted to care. She drifted in and out of a haze, her mind replaying the strikes, the cold grip of his fingers on her chin, the echo of his whisper. Mine. At some point in the night, a noise pulled her from her shallow sleep. A soft shuffle, the low creak of a door. Her breath caught. She strained her ears. Footsteps, slow and cautious, moved past her room. Then silence. Her heart pounded so hard she thought it might crack her ribs. She lay still, waiting for the door to burst open, for his shadow to fall across her again. But nothing came. Minutes passed, or maybe hours. Finally, curiosity outweighed fear. She sat up, her body protesting every movement. She pressed her ear to the door. Silence. She turned the knob slowly, inch by inch, until the latch clicked free. The hallway was empty, the air cold against her face. She stepped out, each footfall a silent question. She crept down the hall, past the woman's small room. A thin line of light leaked from under her door. The woman was awake, watching, waiting. Downstairs, the kitchen door stood slightly ajar. A faint draft drifted through, carrying the smell of earth and damp wood. She stepped inside, her bare feet sticking to the cold floor. The kitchen looked the same, the pot still on the stove, the old spoon resting nearby. But something felt off. Her eyes moved across the walls, searching for clues. Near the back corner, she noticed a narrow gap behind a stack of crates. She hesitated, her breath caught in her throat. Slowly, she pushed the crates aside. Behind them, a small, hidden door. The wood was rough, splintered at the edges, as though someone had once tried to claw it open. Her fingers trembled as she reached for the handle. The door groaned open, revealing a narrow stairway leading down into darkness. She paused, the smell of damp earth rising up to meet her. Her mind screamed at her to turn back, to close the door and forget, but something stronger pulled her forward. A need to know, to understand the truth she had only glimpsed in whispers and glances. She descended slowly, her hand trailing along the wall. Each step creaked, each breath echoed. At the bottom, the darkness felt alive, pressing against her skin like wet cloth. She squinted, trying to make sense of the shapes around her. A single lantern hung from a nail on the far wall, its flame small and sputtering. She crossed the dirt floor, her steps unsteady, and lifted the lantern. In the flickering light, she saw them. Bundles of old clothes, shoes scattered in piles, broken hairpins and torn ribbons. She recognized the blue ribbon immediately. The same color, the same frayed edge she had held in her hands before. A journal lay on top of one pile, its cover cracked and stained. Her fingers hovered above it, afraid to touch, but the pull was too strong. She opened it slowly. The pages were filled with shaky handwriting, some words smudged and nearly illegible. Day 12. He watches me even when I sleep. I can't breathe without thinking he hears it. Day 19. I tried to run. The fence? I didn't make it. Day 27. I hear the others at night, their voices begging. He says they're gone, but I hear them. Day 35. If someone finds this, please don't trust him. Don't trust the quiet. It's a lie. The words blurred as tears filled her eyes. She flipped through more pages, her hands shaking violently. Each entry painted the same horror. Isolation, punishment, vanished girls who were never seen again. She dropped the journal, her legs giving out beneath her. The lantern swung in her hand, casting wild shadows on the walls. A sudden noise above. A footstep. Her head snapped up, heart hammering. She stumbled to her feet, the journal falling open at her side. She grabbed it, clutching it to her chest as though it could shield her. She snuffed the lantern quickly, plunging the room into darkness again. She pressed herself against the wall, listening. The footstep moved closer, then paused. Silence swallowed the cellar again. She didn't know if it was him or the woman, or something else entirely. But in that darkness, her fear found a new shape. Not just of him, but of the house itself, of the land that held so many secrets it could no longer contain them. She waited there, her breath ragged, her fingers gripping the journal until they ached. Above, the floorboards creaked once more, then quiet. In that silence, she understood fully. Finally, this was not a home, not a ranch, not a prison in the simple sense. It was a machine built to erase, to swallow, to turn girls into echoes. She pressed her forehead to the journal, the words bleeding into her skin. A single thought cut through her terror, sharp and sudden. I need to get out, or I will become another voice in these pages. She stayed crouched in the cellar for what felt like hours, the journal pressed to her chest like a shield. The darkness seemed to close around her, thick and alive. Each breath felt borrowed, each heartbeat a small, dangerous rebellion. Eventually, her legs began to cramp. She shifted carefully, listening for any sounds above. The silence stretched out long and thin, so tight she thought it might snap. With trembling hands, she opened the journal again. Her eyes scanned the words, moving faster now, devouring every detail. He says I'm special, but I hear them at night. The crying, the begging. I saw a girl's dress in the yard once. It was gone by morning. I wrote a note. I tried to hide it in the grain sacks. He found it. He always finds everything. I saw a woman in the kitchen. She looked at me once. I thought she might help. She didn't. If you read this, don't wait. Don't trust the quiet moments. They're traps. He likes when we think he's not watching. Each entry felt like a whisper directly into her ear. Words from someone who had stood where she now knelt, felt the same terror crawling through their veins. One page in the back was different. The handwriting had become frantic. Letters slashed across the paper. I think someone else was here before me. I found a ribbon that wasn't mine. A name carved into the cellar wall. It wasn't mine. There have been so many. She looked up, her eyes scanning the walls in the dim light. She crawled forward, her fingers tracing the rough, damp boards. At first, she saw nothing but splinters and old stains. Then her nails caught on something shallow and sharp. She leaned closer. Letters, carved deep, nearly hidden under grime and moss. She scraped at them with her fingernails until they stood out. Anna. A single name, small and crooked. She stared at it for a long time, as if it might suddenly speak, explain itself. Another girl, another ghost in this living tomb. The journal trembled in her hands. She flipped back to the front cover, hoping for a name, something human to hold on to. But there was only a single, faded initial. L. Anna. L. And now, her. A cold wave rolled over her, stronger than before. She wasn't the first. She wouldn't be the last. This place fed on them, one after another, erasing them until nothing remained but whispers in the floorboards and scratches in the walls. She felt her breathing turn sharp and fast. Her vision swam. She pressed her back against the wall, sliding down until she sat on the damp dirt, knees to her chest. Up above, the floor creaked again. She froze, straining to listen. A soft shuffle, a door closing, then silence. She had to act. The idea pressed down on her, urgent and bright, burning through her fear like a sudden flame. If she waited, she would end up like Anna, like Elle, like all the others. But how? Her mind turned in tight, painful circles. The gate. The side path she had seen once from the kitchen window. She remembered the faint outline of a narrow trail beyond the fence, snaking into the dry fields. She clutched the journal tighter. She would take it with her. A map of pain, a final proof she wasn't imagining it all. Carefully she rose, her legs numb and weak. Each step toward the stairs felt like pushing against deep water. She set the lantern back on the crate, snuffed the flame, and crept up the stairs, each creak echoing through her bones. At the top, she pressed her ear to the cellar door. Silence. She pushed it open slowly. The hallway beyond, dark and empty. The house felt still, the air thick as if holding its breath. She stepped into the kitchen, her feet nearly silent on the floor. The woman was gone. Only the cold pot sat on the stove, the spoon resting beside it like a discarded limb. Her eyes drifted to the door leading outside. It stood ajar, swaying gently in the wind. Beyond it, the fields stretched wide and open, painted in gray moonlight. She took a step forward, then another. Her heart thundered, her fingers tightening around the journal until the edges cut into her palm. A shape moved at the edge of her vision. She snapped her head to the side. In the corner of the kitchen, barely visible in the dark, the woman stood, her eyes wide, her breath shallow. For a heartbeat, they just looked at each other. The girl's lips parted, a silent plea forming, but the woman shook her head slowly, her mouth a tight line of sorrow. Then the woman's gaze shifted, flicking toward the open door, then back to the girl. A silent message. A single chance. The girl swallowed hard, nodding once, almost imperceptibly. She moved toward the door, each step a battle against her screaming mind. The wind touched her face, sharp and cold, like a slap back into herself. As she crossed the threshold, the woman stepped forward, grabbing the door and pushing it wider. Their eyes met one last time, a flicker of something unspoken passing between them. Then she was outside, the earth hard and cold under her bare feet. She ran past the broken crates, past the sagging fence, into the open yard. Behind her, the house loomed silent and dark. She felt its gaze on her back, heavy and hungry. But for the first time, she didn't stop. She ran until her lungs burned, until her legs screamed. In her hand, the journal felt like a heartbeat. Proof of the others, proof of herself, proof that she was still alive, even if just for this moment. She didn't know how far she ran before her legs finally gave out. The cold bit at her skin, each breath clawing at her throat like broken glass. She collapsed near a low stone wall at the edge of the property, the journal still clutched in her hand like a lifeline. The sky above was a deep, endless black, dotted with distant stars that looked indifferent to her terror. The fields stretched around her, endless and empty, a flat ocean of dry grass whispering under the wind. She pressed her forehead to the rough stone, her fingers white from gripping the journal too tightly. Her mind was a swirl of images. Anna's name carved in the cellar, the broken ribbon, the woman's silent gaze. Somewhere behind her, the house waited, its presence hanging over the land like a curse. She could almost feel him moving inside, discovering her absence, feeling the weight of her defiance like a blade against his throat. She knew she couldn't stop for long. If he came now, she had no strength left to fight. She forced herself to her feet, each joint screaming in protest. She turned her eyes to the faint line of a trail leading away from the house. A thin, crooked path that snaked into the fields, barely visible under moonlight. She took a step, then another. The journal felt heavy now, but she refused to let go. After what felt like an eternity of stumbling through the tall grass, she saw it. A narrow wooden gate, half fallen, barely holding on to its hinges. Beyond it, the trail dipped into a shallow gully, disappearing behind a line of twisted, skeletal trees. She reached the gate and paused, her chest heaving. She looked back once. The ranch house sat in the distance, a dark shape against the pale night sky. No lights, no movement, but she knew he would come. She turned back to the gate, pushing it open slowly. It screeched in protest, echoing across the fields like a scream. She winced, glancing back again. Then she heard it, a soft rustle nearby. She froze. A figure stepped out from behind one of the trees. For a breathless moment, her heart stopped. She stumbled back, ready to flee, but the figure lifted a hand. A slow, careful gesture of peace. It was the woman. Up close now, the woman looked smaller than she had appeared in the house. Her shoulders hunched forward, her eyes wide and trembling in the moonlight. But there was something fierce beneath that fear. A small, steady flame that flickered behind her hollow gaze. The girl opened her mouth, her voice caught in her raw throat. "Please," she rasped. The woman stepped closer, her hand reaching forward. She pressed something small and cold into the girl's palm. "A key. South Gate," the woman whispered, her voice almost lost to the wind. "There's a path. Take it. Don't stop. Don't look back." The girl stared at the key, her fingers curling around it automatically. Why are you helping me?" she managed to say, her voice cracking. The woman's eyes flicked toward the house, then back to her. A tear slipped down her cheek, catching the moonlight. "I couldn't help them," she whispered. "But I can help you." Their eyes locked, a silent, desperate exchange of everything they couldn't say aloud. Then the woman turned, disappearing back into the shadows as quickly as she had appeared. The girl stared after her, her breath shuddering. The key bit into her palm, cold and sharp, a promise and a weapon. She turned toward the south path, her legs trembling but driven by a force stronger than pain or fear. She limped forward, each step a battle, each movement fueled by the echo of the woman's words. Don't stop. Don't look back. She passed the twisted trees, the wind tugging at her hair, pulling at her torn dress. The grass clawed at her ankles, but she pushed on, her mind focused on a single image, the open road beyond the gate, a place he couldn't reach. The journal slapped against her side with every step. She thought of the names inside, the stories trapped in ink and tears. She thought of Anna, of Elle, of all the other girls whose voices had been swallowed by that house, and she thought of the woman, the small, hunched figure who had carried her own private guilt like a wound, finally daring to break her silence. A sound behind her, a faint, distant shout. Her breath caught. She forced herself to run faster, the world a blur of moonlight and shadows. The path twisted sharply, opening into a clearing. At the far end, she saw the south gate, a tall, narrow frame of iron bars, rusted and cracked, standing like the final guardian to another world. She stumbled toward it, her lungs burning. She fumbled with the key, her fingers slick with sweat and blood. Another shout. Closer now. The key slid into the lock, turning with a harsh metallic click that felt like thunder in her chest. She shoved the gate open, the hinges shrieking in protest. Beyond it, an old dirt road stretched into the horizon, empty and waiting. She stepped through, her body collapsing to the ground on the other side. She pushed herself back up, every nerve screaming. Behind her, the wind carried another shout, a deep, furious bellow that froze her blood. But she didn't stop. She pushed forward, into the road, into the unknown, her feet pounding the hard earth. The journal thumped against her ribs, the key still in her hand. Don't stop. Don't look back. She repeated it over and over, a chant, a prayer, a vow. The road beyond the gate felt like another world, silent, endless, untouched by the cold hands of the ranch. The moon hung above her, sharp and distant, its light stretching across the dirt path like a thin, trembling ribbon. She didn't dare stop. Her breath burned in her lungs, each inhale slicing her from the inside. The key pressed into her palm, slick with sweat and blood, as though it had become part of her now. She stumbled forward, the journal thumping against her side. The pages inside whispered with each step, voices of girls who had never made it this far. Their words pooled in her mind, weaving with her own fear and her own fragile hope. After what felt like hours, she found a shallow ditch on the side of the road. She dropped to her knees, her arms shaking uncontrollably. She pressed her forehead to the ground, sobs breaking from her chest in jagged, silent bursts. For a moment, she thought of turning back. Not to him, but to the woman. The woman's hollow eyes, the quiet strength that had flashed in that last moment, the guilt, the shared pain. But there was no going back. She forced herself to sit up, wiping dirt and tears from her face with trembling fingers. She opened the journal, flipping to the last pages. I wanted to leave. I wanted to run. But I waited too long. He took everything before I even stepped outside. If someone reads this, don't wait for perfect timing. There isn't one. You run when you can. You live with the scars, or, you don't live at all. She read the lines over and over, letting them sink into her bones. Each sentence felt like a cold hand pushing her forward. She stood again, swaying as her vision blurred. She forced her legs to move, one foot after the other. Her entire body felt like it was made of broken glass, each step shattering her from the inside. The road curved, revealing a narrow trail branching off to the right. She hesitated, squinting into the darkness. The trail dipped into a grove of twisted, leafless trees, their branches reaching toward the sky like skeletal hands. A memory flashed in her mind, the woman's whispered directions. South Gate. Hidden path. Don't stop. Don't look back. She turned down the trail. The trees closed around her, swallowing the moonlight, turning the world into a tunnel of shifting shadows. The journal seemed to glow faintly in her hand, as though lit by some inner flame. Each sound felt amplified. The snap of a twig beneath her foot, the rasp of her breath, the distant echo of something moving behind her. She glanced back once, a reflex she immediately regretted. In the distance, beyond the trees, a shape moved along the road, slow, heavy, determined. Her heart seized. She pressed herself forward, deeper into the dark. She stumbled through low brush, branches clawing at her arms and tearing her dress. She didn't care. Each scratch felt like a promise that she was still here, still moving, still her own. Finally, she reached a small clearing. A dry creek bed cut across it. The earth cracked and pale under the moonlight. On the far side, an old wooden fence leaned crookedly, half swallowed by weeds. Beyond it, open fields stretching into darkness. She fell to her knees at the edge of the creek, gasping for air. The journal slipped from her hand, landing in the dirt. She grabbed it again, holding it to her chest, as though afraid the earth might swallow it too. She pressed her forehead to her knees, her body shuddering. The whispers in her head grew louder. All the warnings, all the desperate entries from girls who had come before her. Don't wait. Don't look back. She forced herself to stand. Her knees buckled, but she caught herself on a low branch. The fence waited ahead, her final barrier. She waded across the dry creek, her bare feet scraping over sharp stones. Blood mixed with dirt, but she barely felt it. At the fence, she pushed at a loose board, her fingers raw and bleeding. The wood groaned, splinters embedding into her skin. She pushed harder, ignoring the pain, her breath coming in short, ragged bursts. Finally, the board gave way. A narrow gap opened, just wide enough for her to slip through. She turned sideways, squeezing her bruised body into the opening. The journal scraped against the rough wood, but she held on, teeth clenched, every muscle screaming. On the other side, she collapsed onto the dry grass, her body folding into itself. For a moment, she didn't move. She simply lay there, feeling the cold seep into her bones, listening to the wind rush over the fields. Then she heard it. A distant shout. Low at first, then sharper, slicing through the night. He had found the trail. A surge of adrenaline snapped her back to life. She scrambled to her feet, gripping the journals so tightly she thought the cover might tear. She staggered forward, pushing into the open fields, her eyes locked on the horizon. No more fences, no more gates, only the endless dark ahead. She ran, each step tearing her further from the house, from him, from the ghosts in the cellar. Above, the stars shimmered, distant and cold, but for the first time, they felt like witnesses rather than judges. She didn't look back. She didn't stop. The journal pressed against her side, the key still in her fist. The last remnants of all the girls before her, the voices she carried now as her own. She ran until her legs felt like hollow sticks, each step threatening to collapse beneath her. The cold wind cut at her cheeks, drying the tears that still streamed freely down her face. The moon guided her, a pale companion overhead, its light the only thread holding her to the world beyond the fields. Behind her, the shouts grew louder, his voice, no longer calm or measured, now an animal roar, raw and sharp, echoing through the open night. She forced herself forward, lungs on fire, her heartbeat crashing in her ears. Every breath tasted of blood and fear. A dark shape loomed ahead, a low ridge of earth, crowned with a twisted wooden gate standing crooked against the sky like a broken jaw. Beyond it, she could just make out the dark line of a dirt road, stretching toward the distant glow of something. Maybe a town, maybe nothing at all. Her feet tangled in the tall grass, and she fell hard, her palms splitting open against the rocks. She lay there for a moment, gasping, the journal sliding from her grasp and landing in the dirt. A branch snapped behind her. She looked back. He was there, closer than she'd ever imagined. His shape cut through the moonlight, tall, solid, unstoppable. His breath clouded in the cold air, each exhale a growl. In his hand, she saw something glint, a heavy iron tool, curved like a hook. She grabbed the journal, clutching it to her chest. Her fingers scrabbled at the dirt, pushing herself upright. She stumbled forward, her entire body screaming for her to stop, to lie down, to surrender. "Stop!" he roared, his voice splitting the night. "Stop now, or I swear I'll make you wish you never breathed." She didn't stop. He surged forward, each stride closing the space between them. The earth seemed to tilt under her feet, the stars spinning overhead. She reached the gate, her hands slipping on the rotted wood. She threw her weight against it, the hinges shrieking in protest. His footsteps thundered behind her. She felt the ground shake, each vibration crawling up her spine. She pushed again, the gate cracking open just enough for her to slip through. A hand closed around her arm. The cold iron of his fingers burned her skin, the force yanking her backward so violently she thought her shoulder would rip from its socket. She screamed, a raw primal sound that tore through the fields. He dragged her back, his breath hot and foul against her neck. "You think you can leave me?" he hissed, his words wrapping around her like chains. "You think you're different? You think you're better than the others?" She twisted, her nails clawing at his wrist. Her foot connected with his shin, but he only grunted, tightening his grip. The journal slipped from her grasp, landing between them in the dirt. His eyes flicked down to it. For a moment, his grip loosened, just enough. She lunged for the journal, scooping it up with both hands. He grabbed her hair, yanking her head back. Her neck burned with pain. She turned, swinging the journal at his face with all the force her trembling arms could muster. The corner struck his cheek, splitting the skin just below his eye. He howled, stumbling back. His free hand rose to his face, fingers slick with blood. She didn't wait. She threw herself forward, crashing through the half-open gate. Her legs folded beneath her on the other side, her chin striking the frozen ground. Stars burst behind her eyes, but she pushed herself up again, crawling. Behind her he roared, the sound almost inhuman. She felt his fingers brush her ankle cold and hard before she kicked out blindly, her heel connecting with something soft. Another scream. She scrambled forward, slipping and sliding in the mud, her hands grasping at weeds and stones. Then she was free of the gate, free of his grasp. She pushed to her feet, stumbling down the slight slope toward the road. Her breath rattled in her chest. Every cell in her body burned, but she kept moving. On the road, she turned back once. He stood in the gate, blood streaking his face, eyes wide and wild. His chest heaved with rage. For a moment, their eyes locked, a silent clash between predator and prey, between captor and the one who dared to slip the leash. She turned away, the journal pressed to her heart, and ran. Each step echoed through her, a drumbeat of her own fragile victory. She ran not toward something, but away. Away from the cellar, away from the fence, away from the voice that whispered mine in the dark. Her tears blurred the road ahead, but she didn't slow down. The sky above shifted, the moon sliding behind a thin veil of clouds, as though shielding her in her final flight. She didn't know where she was going. She didn't know who she would find, or if anyone would help her. But for the first time, she felt the thin thread of possibility stretch before her, a path that belonged to her alone. She held the journal tight, the voices of the lost girls whispering around her, not as chains, but as wings. And she ran into the night, the cold wind wrapping around her like a promise. The dirt road stretched ahead of her like a narrow river of dust, shimmering under the moon's fading light. Each step felt as if it might be her last. Her lungs burned, her knees threatened to buckle, but she didn't stop. Behind her, the echoes of his voice still rang in the night. Curses, threats, the wild animal cry of a man who had lost control. She glanced back once more, her vision swimming. She saw him stumbling through the broken gate, clutching his bloodied face. Even at a distance, she could feel his rage reaching for her, long fingers clawing through the darkness. She turned away sharply, nearly collapsing onto the road. The journal bounced against her ribs, the pages inside crackling with each jolt. She clutched it closer, as if it contained her only remaining breath. A pale mist began to roll across the fields, swirling around her legs. It carried the smell of dry grass and earth, cool and almost gentle compared to the sharp metallic scent that clung to her skin. She pushed forward, her body no longer fully hers. She felt herself moving from some deeper instinct, the raw animal knowledge that if she slowed even for a moment, she would die. The road dipped into a shallow ravine. She stumbled down the incline, sliding on loose stones, her hands scraping against the rough ground. At the bottom, a dry creek bed wound like a pale scar across the earth. She waded through it, each step a battle against her own weakening muscles. The cold mud sucked at her feet, pulling, begging her to stay. She tore free again and again, her breath breaking into small sobs. On the far bank, she pulled herself up, clawing at the roots of a fallen tree. The bark shredded her palms, blood mixing with dirt. She didn't care. She rolled onto her back at the top, staring up at the sky. The stars seemed closer now, sharp points of light that watched her with indifferent curiosity. For a moment, she let herself cry. The tears flowed hot and fast, washing streaks of dirt from her cheeks. She curled onto her side, hugging the journal to her chest, the sobs shaking her entire body. Then, from somewhere behind her, she heard the faint crunch of boots on gravel. Her heart seized. She pushed herself to her feet so quickly she nearly collapsed again. Her legs trembled beneath her, but she forced them forward, each step a tiny miracle of willpower. She followed a narrow trail that snaked through a cluster of low, thorny bushes. Branches clawed at her face and arms, leaving thin red lines across her skin. She welcomed the sting. Each cut reminded her she was still alive, still moving. Through a break in the bushes, she saw it. A faint glow on the horizon. A road? A distant farmhouse? A town? She couldn't tell, but it meant people. It meant something beyond him. She pushed harder, breaking into a stumbling run. Her breath rasped like a saw, each inhale slicing her ribs. The ground blurred beneath her feet, the sky above a shifting swirl of clouds and stars. A sudden crash behind her, a sharp, snapping crack of wood splintering. She dared a glance back and saw him breaking through the bushes, his silhouette monstrous in the moonlight. "Stop!" he bellowed, his voice shredded and raw. "I will find you. You belong to me." She turned away, forcing her legs to move faster. Her mind screamed at her to keep going, keep going, keep going. She burst from the final line of bushes onto a flat, open stretch of land. A thin dirt path cut through it, winding toward that distant glow. She ran. She felt every heartbeat as a separate explosion in her chest. Her vision flickered at the edges, her head light with exhaustion and terror. But she didn't slow. Behind her, his footsteps pounded against the earth, closer now. She could almost feel his hand reaching for her neck, his breath on her ear. The memory of his voice twisted in her head. A snake coiled around her spine. She screamed, a sound so raw it tore at the night itself, scattering the stars above. And then, headlights. A pair of bright beams cut through the darkness ahead, bouncing slightly over the rough ground. A truck. She threw herself forward, waving her arms, the journal nearly slipping from her grasp. Her voice rose again, a ragged plea that filled the empty fields. The truck braked hard, dust exploding around its tires. The driver's door flung open. A man jumped out, his face pale in the headlights, eyes wide with shock. "Help me!" she screamed, her voice cracking. "Please!" He rushed forward, catching her as her knees gave way. Her body sagged into his arms, her whole frame shuddering. Behind them, her pursuer emerged from the darkness, eyes wild and mouth twisted into a snarl. The driver turned, pulling her behind him. "Stay back!" he shouted, voice firm and steady. For a heartbeat, everything froze. The man from the ranch stood panting, his fists clenched at his sides. He took one slow step forward, then another, his gaze fixed on her. Then, as if the spell broke, he turned and bolted back into the darkness, disappearing among the trees. She collapsed fully then, her face pressed to the ground, sobs tearing through her. The driver knelt beside her, speaking softly, words she couldn't understand at first. Finally, she felt strong enough to look up. The glow of the truck's lights washed over her, illuminating the journal still clutched in her arms. She held it tighter, her fingers digging into the battered cover. Above them, the stars blinked silently, and somewhere in the distance, the first hints of dawn began to brush the sky. She had run, she had screamed, and she had survived. For now, that was enough. She sat in the cab of the truck, her body wrapped in an old blanket the driver had pulled from behind the seat. The warmth should have comforted her, but it felt distant, unreal, like a memory of safety she no longer trusted. The driver, a middle-aged man with sun-leathered skin and worried eyes, glanced at her every few seconds. He tried to speak, his voice low and careful, but the words washed over her in a dull, muffled wave. She clutched the journal to her chest, her fingers locked so tightly they had turned white. Every bump in the road sent small shocks of pain through her battered body, but she didn't let go. Outside, the world shifted from darkness to the first weak light of dawn. The empty fields blurred past the window, turning from black to gray, then slowly revealing the brittle yellow of dry grass. Somewhere far behind them, the ranch still stood. Even from miles away, she could feel its cold grip clawing at her back, whispering that she would never truly escape. The truck turned onto a paved road, the sudden smoothness jolting her mind awake. Signs began to appear, their reflective surfaces catching the early light. The driver spoke again, this time more firmly. "You're safe now," he said. "We're going to town. There's a sheriff's station, a doctor." The words circled in her head, colliding with the memory of the cellar walls, the woman's hollow eyes, the burn of the strap on her back. Safe. The word felt heavy, foreign. She nodded once, her lips dry and cracked. They pulled into a small town as the sun finally broke the horizon, spilling pale gold across empty streets. She saw houses, a gas station, a diner with chairs stacked on tables inside. The truck rolled to a stop in front of a low brick building with a faded sign, "Sheriff's Office." The driver got out first, speaking to someone inside. Moments later, 2 deputies stepped out, their expressions shifting from sleepy confusion to sharp, professional urgency as they took in her torn dress, her blood-streaked skin, the wild terror still lingering in her eyes. They moved carefully, as if approaching a wounded animal. One reached out a hand, pausing when she flinched. "It's okay," he said softly. "You're safe now. You can come inside." She looked at him, her eyes catching on the word safe again. Something inside her shifted, a small, reluctant release, like a tightly knotted rope beginning to fray. She slid out of the truck, her feet touching the ground as if for the first time. The journal remained pressed to her chest, her anchor to the voices that had led her this far. They guided her inside, the cool air smelling faintly of coffee and old paper. A woman approached, a nurse, or maybe a volunteer. She wrapped a blanket around her shoulders, guiding her to a chair. The deputies asked questions. "Who did this? Where were you? How long?" She opened her mouth, but no sound came out. Her throat closed around each word, the memories too heavy to push through. She looked down at the journal. Slowly, as if moving underwater, she handed it to the nearest deputy. Her fingers lingered on the cover, a silent farewell to the voices within. The deputy opened it, his brow furrowing as he flipped through the pages. He looked at her again, something dark and sharp passing through his eyes. "We'll take care of this," he said. She nodded, her eyes sinking to the floor. A doctor arrived, gentle hands examining her cuts and bruises, murmuring reassurances she could barely hear. Warm water, clean cloth, antiseptic stinging on her skin. Each touch felt like a question she wasn't ready to answer. At some point, they offered her food. She shook her head. The taste of dirt and blood still clung to her mouth, making the thought of swallowing impossible. The sky outside turned fully blue, the sun climbing higher, oblivious to the wreckage it illuminated. People passed by the windows, staring, whispering. She curled tighter in the chair, the blanket swallowing her thin frame. Her eyes drifted closed for moments at a time, opening again to catch the deputies speaking in low, urgent tones. In one of those brief flickers of rest, she saw a vision. The fence, the broken gate, the open road beyond, her own silhouette standing in the field, a faint outline slowly dissolving into the morning mist. She felt a hollow ache in her chest. Escape had cost her more than blood and bruises. It had stolen pieces she might never reclaim. But beneath that ache, somewhere impossibly deep, a tiny ember remained. It wasn't hope. Not yet. It was something raw, survival, stubborn and flickering. One deputy approached again. "We'll keep you safe here," he said. "He can't get to you now." She raised her eyes to him, her voice a rasp, barely there. "Don't let him find me," she whispered. His face tightened, but he nodded. "We won't." She leaned back, her body sagging into the chair, as if finally realizing it could rest. The blanket shifted, revealing the torn edge of her dress, the bruises blooming along her arms. Outside, the first sounds of morning began to drift in. A dog barking, a truck rumbling down the street, the clatter of dishes in a diner kitchen. Life, indifferent and unstoppable. She closed her eyes. For the first time in what felt like centuries, she let herself fall fully into the dark, her body heavy, her breath slow. Tomorrow the questions would come. Tomorrow the wounds would be counted and named. But tonight, or what was left of it, she had won. And though the cost had carved deep into her, though she might never be whole again, she had done the one thing he swore she never would. She had fled. She had survived.